Welcome to the Love Lab Podcast, a safe and fun place to get real and learn about sex. Whether you're a man or woman, single or couple, this is the show for you. I am your host, Kevin Anthony, and I am here to guide you to go from good to amazing in the bedroom and your relationships. All right, welcome back to the Love Lab Podcast. This is episode 312, and it is titled, How Erotic Energy Mapping Can Help Your Sex Life. So, here on the Love Lab Podcast, if you've listened for any amount of time, you understand that I am all about finding and presenting to you as many tools, modalities, books, information, whatever, as much stuff as we can possibly find to help us in the realm of sex, love, and relationship. One of the reasons I like to do that is because no one tool works for everybody. So we need a whole toolbox full of things that we could potentially pull out, because you might try one on and go, that doesn't really work for me. You might try another one on and go, yes, that totally solved my problem. This is kind of funny because I have conversations with people all the time, and I'll talk about a certain thing. That doesn't work for me. I'm like, okay, well, just because it doesn't work for you doesn't mean it doesn't work for other people, right? So the idea here is to have as many tools as we can to really become the best version of ourselves that we can. And so today we're really going to be talking about something called erotic energy mapping and how that tool can potentially help us. Obviously, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see that I have a guest with me today. You can also see that I have her book here. So we're going to dive into that. But before we do, a short word from my sponsor, Power and Mastery 3.0. Power Mastery 3.0 is the latest version of the popular men's sexual mastery course. If you are struggling with erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, or simply want to increase your skills in the bedroom, then Power and Mastery is for you. Join the exclusive club of men who have taken their sexual performance into their own hands and become sexual masters. Mastering your sexuality is a key component to becoming the man she has always dreamt of and craves. Don't leave your sexual performance up to chance or the throw of the dice. Become a sexual master today by going to powerandmastery.com and joining the exclusive club of men who have taken their destiny into their own hands. That's powerandmastery.com. That is yet again another tool that you can use to become the best version of yourself and have the best sex of your life. So go check that out. All right. So on today's show, I have a guest with me. Her name is Stefanie Iris Weiss. She is a New York City-based writer, a certified clinical sexologist, and professional astrologer in private practice for 2 decades. Her latest book, Sex and Your Stars, A Sexologist's Guide to the Erotic Energy of the Zodiac, is out now on Sounds True. Welcome to the show, Stefanie.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Well, thanks for coming on. I personally, I'm sure there are a lot of shows out there where they have a team of people that book all the guests and the host just shows up. That's not the way the Love Lab podcast works. I read every email from every publicist that pitches me, and I go, does this person sound interesting to me or not? So if you're here, I obviously thought that you were interesting. What got me was, because I did once have an astrologer on the show, and I've had others pitch me, and I have not had it on the show. But what really stuck out to me was the fact that you also have a background as a certified clinical sexologist, right? So this is obviously 100% the wheelhouse of the Love Lab podcast, right? I just got super curious about how you combine those two. So my first question is, and I guess it is a question, but it's basically, could you tell the audience a little bit about your background in clinical sexology and astrology?
Yes. I think I get asked a question like this in a lot of the interviews that I do. And what I've come to realize is that I should say this at the outset, like I was meant to do both of these things. Like it's in my chart. But I don't think that I knew that I was meant to do each of these things until, the point at which it became clear that I sort of had to do them. So starting with the clinical sexology, I've always been the person, and I talk a little bit about my biography and my background, where I grew up in a household raised by parents who owned a head shop. And, there was just a lot of open conversation about bodies in my house. And I felt very comfortable always my whole life talking about bodies as they were, without shame. And then I realized at some point, probably in my 20s, that I was the go-to person of my friend group, who people were like, I'm having this issue with my partner and something about, our sex life. Like, people always came to me to talk to me about it, which is what, people who end up in this business are usually that person in their friend group, right? Right? Yeah, exactly. So we kind of get the message that, like, oh, this is, people feel comfortable with us around this topic, right? And this was always the case. And as I also say in the book, like, everything I've ever learned to do, I've learned to do by writing about it. So my journey to becoming a certified clinical sexologist began with being a sex writer. So I wrote a book called Eco-Sex, Go Green Between the Sheets and Make Your Love Life Sustainable, came out in 2010. And that launched my career as a sex writer. I had a couple of advice columns built around sexuality. I wrote, service pieces about vibrators and feminist porn and like all these different amazing topics, and did reported pieces at sex parties, and just like had a great time learning about all of this and giving out advice and just absorbing so much knowledge. And then the pandemic hit, and I realized I had spent all these years dispensing all this knowledge, and I really wanted to be credentialed in something that I was already doing anyway. So I got credentialed, and became a certified clinical sexologist and sex coach. And all along, in all of these years, I was doing astrology throughout.
Yeah, that is an interesting journey, and you're right, because I was absolutely that person too. I never thought that I was going to be, coaching people in sex or relationships. I was always pursuing it for my own personal interest, reading all the books, taking the workshops, doing all that stuff just because I wanted to learn it for myself. And then I started noticing that, of course, my friend group started asking for a lot of advice. But then the thing, and I still was resistant to this idea, but it was literally when like absolute strangers would stop me in public and ask me questions. I'm like, I've never seen you before in my life. What in the world made you decide you wanted to walk up to me in a public place and ask me such a personal question? And I was not in the public sphere at all when that happened. I mean, that literally happened to me. I had no YouTube channel, I had no podcast, none of that. It's not like they could have known who I was, right? And so that's when I was like, okay, I'm getting it. Yes, you had to hit me over the head with a 2x4 for me to understand, but I realized I'm supposed to do this. So you're right. That is a very common scenario for a lot of us. So okay, so that's how you got into doing clinical psychology, clinical sexology, and all along you were doing the astrology. What
Yes.
made you decide to combine these two?
Well, I had already been combining them in astrology readings with clients. So that's the other piece of this that sort of comes together for me years ago, which is that, speaking to what you just said, like, complete strangers would come up to you and ask you questions. When I would have a client come in for an astrology reading, which was ostensibly not about sex, just a natal reading or a transit reading, and they didn't know anything about me, even before I wrote the book Eco-Sex and was, becoming known as a sex writer, the clients started to tell me, this is another way that I sort of got the message that I was supposed to be doing more in sexuality. Clients began to tell me, began to say, like, can I ask this question about, about my sex life with my partner, or, I'm having issues with orgasm, whatever it is. And then they would say things like, I'm so comfortable talking to you about this, but I can't even talk to my therapist about it. Right. So it's another way that I started to get the message. And at that point, going back many years, I started to look at people's charts to better understand, because I was, I've always been really curious and open about sex. So I was like, well, what is going on here with these points in the chart with these different planets? And these houses, like what is it saying about sexuality? So that part of the journey like began a long time ago. But it was again after I got my certification in clinical sexology, and I should say this, like writing about astrology and writing horoscopes, and I have been asked many times throughout the years to write sexual astrology, it's sexual horoscopes, relationship horoscopes, love horoscopes. Like I've done plenty of that. So that's another way that I combined it. But it was during the pandemic that I was like, yeah, this is something is really screaming for me to put these two areas of expertise together in a form that I can give to the public, because they work so well together.
Well, I do have to say, as you can see if you're watching, I have the book here, and I did have an opportunity to read the section about my sign, and I thought it was pretty funny because a lot of it really is true. And what's interesting is so, as there is with every sign, there's the positive aspect and the negative aspect, right? So there's like when you're really in balance, how do you show up? And when you're out of balance, how do you show up? So every sign has both of those sides to it. And usually when people read those things, whichever side they believe they're on, like I'm doing all the right things, or I'm doing whatever it is, they tend to look at whatever side they don't like and like, oh, no, I'm not like that, or no. But reading it, like I could really honestly see, I go, okay, here's where I am, but I can see on the other side where I either was, or I could see the potential to be there if I was out of balance. So I really actually found it quite interesting and fascinating. Maybe when we get into it later, I'll show you all the parts I highlighted in the book. But, I think sometimes, listeners will, if they're not into astrology, might just sort of scoff at the whole idea and be like, that's just a bunch of kind of woo-woo nonsense. We're going to get into this because this is leading into my next question. The reason I bring that up about, going through the book and seeing the areas that make sense is like, how do you explain that really? Like, how do you explain that reading this when it wasn't written about me in particular could so accurately describe certain parts of my personality? And they're not so generic that they would describe anybody. Like, if I were to have, my girlfriend read that, she wouldn't say it describes her at all. But if she read it, she'd be like, oh my God, that's so you. Right? So I just find it interesting. And like I said in the beginning of this show, tools in the toolbox. So if you can learn anything from this that helps you on your journey, that's great. So that brings me then to my next question, which is, what types of things can you tell from a person's chart in regards to their sexuality?
Hmm. I mean, there are so many different ways to examine this. You can look at the planets themselves, you can look at the planets in houses, you can look at the planets in relationship with one another. So if I were doing an erotic energy mapping session, I would look at all of this. Right. I would look at, all of the planets in correspondence to one another. And I would look at the sun sign, which is what you're talking about. Which is what the book focuses on. And, I would look at things that we don't have time to go into here because astrology is so infinite. It could take hours to describe everything that I would do in preparation for a reading with someone about this. But there are some sort of like primary elements. If you look at the sun sign, you look at Venus, you look at Mars, you look at Black Moon Lilith, those core things, which I cover in the book, can tell us so much about our sexual desire, our blocks, our worries, our concerns, the shadow, like the stuff you were talking about when you said you were reading your chapter, the things that you were like, not me, or maybe were you before, or you thought maybe somebody would, read it and be like, well, I don't own this. This isn't me. That's the shadow stuff, right? And that has to be in all of the chapters as well, because we have to look at the shadows before we own our erotic potential, right? And what's great about us. So all of that goes into this process.
Yeah, and I think, in the pre-interview, I think you used a term. You had to have said this term in there because I wrote it down. But what I wrote down was map of the human psyche,
Yeah,
right?
that's the natal chart. Yep.
So I'm wondering if maybe you could expand a little bit on like what does that mean? Like because I think a lot of people think astrology is just this sort of woo-woo thing that doesn't really exist. And if we could relate it to something that was easier for people to understand, like
Mhm.
the fact that this is actually just kind of showing you a map to how your psyche operates.
Yes, 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 yes. That's what the natal chart is. That's a euphemism that I use, a map of the human psyche. So what a natal chart is the moment that you're born. It's basically like a screenshot, a snapshot of the sky above you at that exact second, right? So if we have a person's birth date and time, we have an accurate natal chart of that includes all the houses and the exact ascendant and all of that information. And so how do we how for your audience who know nothing about astrology, they can say, okay, yeah, but that's completely hokey. Like what? Like that's meaningless. Why would you say that has anything to do with the human psyche? And yes, I hear you guys. But what this is, the way that astrologers understand this is based on thousands of years of data, basically, right? Like so collected across cultures, over millennia, of like, what does it mean when, a person is born in a certain moment and the moon is exactly in this position? How does that affect that person's life? Right. So all of that information has been translated and is, and passed down in oral tradition and written in books over all of these years. And that is how we contemporary astrologers who use computers and use astronomical ephemerides to, basically like when I did your chart, you told me your birth time and place. And I just fed it into my computer, into my software to see this map of your psyche, right? So, when we say map of your psyche, when we know where the rising sign is and the moon sign is and the sun sign is, we call those the big three in astrology. And just from knowing those, we can know a lot about a person's personality. When we look at those, we can get a sense of like what a person is drawn to, or what kind of people are drawn to that person. We can get a sense of how does that person feel? This is the moon. How does that person feel internally, emotionally? How does that person feel in terms of like what nurtures that person? And then when we look at the sun, which is a lot of the focus of the book, so what is that person's vitality? What is that person's big energy? What does that person come with and present to everyone? Like what gives a person their glow? So these are just some things, some elements of what we call a map of the human psyche in a natal chart.
Yeah, and I like how you explained that it's, thousands of years of observation that people born in with this configuration tend to show up in this way.
Right.
There likely is some other forces at work, but we don't necessarily need to understand them as long as we have all of that data that shows us the
Yeah.
patterns. So it's basically pattern recognition, right?
That's exactly precisely what it is. It's pattern recognition that's been written down and has been collected over a lot of time, right? So, not dissing psychics and, other kinds of divination, people who do divination, but astrology is not that. And I want people to understand astrology can be used for divination. There are charts that people can draw, like the same way you would like throw down, runes or something. I don't do that. I focus mostly on the psychology of astrology and some prediction. But but that is, the main way in which I use it is to help people feel better and feel more joy and feel more pleasure through, working through their shame and doing shadow work, basically.
Yeah, I find it kind of interesting because many, many, many years ago, a girlfriend of mine was really into astrology, and she was specifically looking for a person that, a partner that had very specific signs. And I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. Like I didn't really spend a whole lot of energy on it. I'm just like, all right, if you say so. But she's the first one that kind of got me interested in it. And what was
Uh-huh.
what was interesting, we want to talk about pattern recognition. Um, Ever since then, I would pay attention. I wouldn't make choices about my relationships based on it. But I would then look back at like, okay, in this relationship, how did it go? How did we relate? Did it work out? What were the things that were good and bad? And then I would go back and, read the astrology. And what does the astrology say? And I started seeing over and over again how much this lined up. And it kind of blew my mind because I'm like, that's just crazy. So then I started kind of relying on it a little bit more. Not saying that I would make all my decisions on it, but I just started paying a little bit more attention to it. So, for instance, when my wife and I first started dating, I obviously looked at the astrology. I looked at both Western and Eastern, and both of them said that we were an amazing match. But there are other systems that exist out there that are more modern systems that claim to take, these older systems into account in the way they process, and give you a result. And some of them said that we were a really like low percentage match, like that we really shouldn't have been together. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting because on the one side we got this stuff that's like you guys are like the best possible combination that exists in astrology. And then you've got over here like, no, 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 you guys shouldn't be together. Like this is not going to work out well for you. Okay, let's just see what actually happens. And I can tell you that it was literally the best relationship I had ever had in my entire life. And it matched up with what the traditional astrology in both systems said better than anything else I have read that's, trying to compare two people and see if they're compatible. So that was my own personal experience with it, and one of the other systems actually has been created by a friend of mine. And I had to say, well, that was not my your thing was not my experience. Sorry. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I know that's the other, that's not so much in the purview of this particular book, but compatibility is another way that we can use astrology through the lens of sexuality. We can look at, you don't just look at the sun signs, you look at much more than that. Because people will constantly come up to me and be like, I'm an Aries and I'm dating a Scorpio, and like, is that okay? And I'll be like, there's a lot more to it than just your Aries, your two suns here. Like Venus is in the room, Mars is in the room, like lots of other planets are in this conversation. So if you really want to know, you need to book a reading with an astrologer and like get the 411 on all the placements.
yeah, yeah. That's a good point. This book is not specifically about compatibility. I just wanted to use that as another example of like my own personal experience with it and
Yeah, I
how
love it.
and how just observing my own life and my own relationships compares to what, it says the likely outcome would be. And it's shockingly accurate.
Yeah, yeah. And another, and I think as you were talking about how like you started to from that old girlfriend who first got you into it, a lot of people find in relationships, I have this pattern as well. They'll find themselves attracted to a particular person, not know their chart necessarily. And then when they do learn the person's chart, they realize they have the same chart as the ex and the one before. It's like, I'm like, asking myself, why do I always date Moon and Gemini men? I don't know, but it always happens. And I'm like, not planning for it, but it keeps happening.
Well, I think actually, if I recall correctly, I mean, this goes back quite a few years, but if I recall correctly, the reason why she had this book, and the reason why she was looking for somebody with a very specific sign was because she was actually trying not to repeat the pattern.
Right.
So in other words, it was just like I keep attracting
True,
these
but yeah,
men that are not working. So she was like, fuck it, I gotta find another way to break this pattern. She's like, the book
right.
says I should be looking for this, so I'm gonna go look for that. Oh, that's pretty funny, actually. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit before we get into showing sort of some of the things, using an example of my reading, showing some of the things that we can learn. Let's talk a little bit about what are some of the common issues that you see come up with your clients when you're doing these erotic energy mappings. Are there any sort of things that you tend to see on a regular basis that this can actually help you see?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very often clients will come in because they either have suffered a loss of libido or they're in a partnership where their partner has had a loss of libido or interest in sex with the partner, and the person who comes to me is the one who's like, I'm still attracted to my partner and still wanna have sex with them, but they're no longer interested in sex, or issues of anorgasmia or of ED of some form. Um, and the whole variety, like the whole gamut of sexual issues come in, but like the one that I find most common is like a libido differences in partners. So one of the ways that I would help a client who was dealing with this was I would be looking at the transits that they're experiencing. And what a transit is so you have your fixed natal chart, which is like just the picture of the sky at the moment that you're born. But because the planets continue to move, right? They kind of like have conversations with your natal planets, and they can create experience for you as you move through your life, right? So Saturn is a good example. Like every 7 years it will make I'm calling it like a conversation, but it will make a transit against your natal Saturn. So those are significant life markers: 7, 14, 21, and 29 and a half at the Saturn return. So I'll look to see if a client is having a particular transit when they come in that might be bringing up this issue. And then I'll look to see, whether there is a pattern. Do they often get into relationships that they have sort of, differentials of libido, or what was the relationship like at the very beginning? I'll look at the compatibility between the partners. I'll look at the partners' transits. All of those kinds of things are possibilities.
Cool. So there's actually quite a bit there
Yeah.
that you're looking at. Um, what I think is kind of interesting about that is, for the most part, when you're looking at astrology or other astrologers' work, they generally don't specifically go into the sexuality piece, right? And so that's what I think is really sort of unique about what it is you're doing, is combining that with the clinical sexology and helping people solve some problems that are persistent. Because a lot of the things that you mentioned are very common problems that we see. So I was curious to ask that question because I was like, is this going to show you stuff that maybe we don't see any other way, or is this just another tool of showing us, some common things? And what I was hearing you say is like, those are a lot of the common things that I see in the work that I do as well, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's like another tool, another way of looking at it, another way of seeing like, here's what's going on here. And once you can see what the problem is, especially if you can get some idea as to the cause of that problem, then you can start working on a solution.
Yes, that's exactly it. Right. I'm not seeing anything unique in terms of, it's the same common issues that all sex coaches or sex therapists tend to experience in their practices, right? Like it's not some new kind of dimension of issue that people are having. They're having human problems in their human relationships. And the astrology is just a different way not a different way to diagnose it, but a different way to help make adjustments so they can see, what might be happening so they can, begin to address it. And the shadow work is really, really helpful there because, we're often when we're looking at someone's sun sign, for instance, we look at the opposite sign. There's a lot of information there about what they might be denying about themselves and where they might be experiencing shame, which, in the work that we do in this field, shame is the biggest, boogeyman of all.
Oh, yes. And it is absolutely amazing how much sexual shame there is out there. Now, this is an interesting thing, right? Because you started off talking about the fact that you grew up in a household where you talked about these things a lot, right? So you didn't have a lot of that shame from your childhood. I did not grow up in a household like that. They absolutely did not talk about sex at all in any way, shape, or form. So, I had very similar upbringing around sex as to most people. Somehow I managed to break out of that because one of the most common pieces of feedback that I get from the work that I do is it's amazing how just easy it is for you to talk about, sex in these like really highly, triggering or taboo or uncomfortable subjects, right? And you just talk about it like it's nothing, right? And so that's part of what I do is by talking about it like that, it's giving people permission to do that
Mm,
themselves. I was
mm,
actually just this weekend spending some time with friends, one of which is a friend of a friend. So it's sort of a new person in our friends circle. And she basically was saying the same thing. She's just like staring at me in awe, like, how in the world do you talk about this stuff, because like most people, she did not have an open upbringing around these subjects, and so it's super difficult and uncomfortable for her. She gets uncomfortable just listening to me talk about it, right?
Right, right, right. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
she's
Go ahead. You go ahead.
I was just gonna, but she's fascinated about it and she wants to be able to talk about it that openly, which is why she was asking me questions all weekend.
I love that. That's wonderful. Yeah, I love when, in social situations, you can, have an experience where someone is like, oh my God, I'm having a breakthrough just being around you. Right?
Yeah.
Like you get to help, like, you're not in like clinic or anything. And this person is just like, oh my God, this is like exactly, I needed to meet you so we could talk about this right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we have a pretty good foundation laid for what it is we're talking about. And I think we did a pretty good job of relating this to something that people can really understand. So I really wanted to try to take this out of the woo-woo, weirdo, you know, category it gets put into and bring it back into something that people can relate to and see that this could potentially be a valid tool for them to use on their journey. So I think we did a pretty good job of that. What I want to do after the break, because I got to take a short break for the second sponsor, but after that, I did give you some of my information. You did run a chart on that. So we're going to do just a little example of what this might look like. And then I'm going to tell you honestly whether or not I think what you are, giving me as feedback, if I resonate with it, if I think that's true, or if I'm just like, nah, that's not me at all, right? So we're just going to use that as a live example. Obviously anybody that's been listening to this show for any length of time knows I share literally everything. When my wife was alive and we did the show together, we shared absolutely everything about our sex life. So, it's not a stretch for me necessarily to share this with you. It's not about me per se. It's really about showing you an example of how this could work. So that's the goal with that. We will do that as soon as we come back on the other side of this break. All right. Are you a couple? Are your relationship and sex life where you want them to be? Are there changes you would like to make but just don't know how? Maybe you think there is nothing that can be done. If you are not 100% happy with where your relationship or sex life is, then get help today and change your life. Go to kevinandceline.com/sex-coaching-couples. Don't worry about the long link. It's in the description. Just go over there and click it. Schedule a strategy call with me today so that we can map out a strategy to get you where you want to go so you can have it all your way. That is kevinandceline.com/sex-coaching-couples. Book your strategy call today. That is obviously a link to my couples coaching program. I have a ton of tools in there to help you. This is actually not one of them. I do not do astrology. So if you want that, we're going to direct you at the end of the show on how you can work with Stephanie. But I have a ton of other tools to help you as a couple get that spark back, rekindle the flame, get that sex life going again, learn how to communicate with each other better, just have an overall better, more harmonious, more loving, more connected, more sexual relationship. So go check that out. Okay. So, as promised before the break, we're going to use me as a guinea pig here as an example. We're going to talk a little bit about the chart and what it says. Obviously, please don't reveal, any detailed personal information about birth date, place of birth, anything like that. And you need to keep a little separation between my public persona and the private world. But, anything that the chart says is fair game. So.
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing your chart with me. I am always every chart that I am given by a client, I feel so humbled, like, to get to see someone's natal fingerprint. It's really wonderful experience for me. So the immediate thing that jumped out, we're going to talk about your sun sign, which is Gemini, in a little bit. But the thing that jumped out at me first was that you are a Taurus rising and that you have your moon in Libra. So the big three is the rising sign, the moon sign, and the sun sign. What that means is your Taurus rising and your moon in Libra are both ruled by Venus. Every sign is ruled by a planet. So Venus, the planet of love and relationships and desire and eroticism, is playing a big part in your chart. It's right there. It's like
Shocking. I mean, seriously, could you really have planned that? I literally am a sex, love, and relationship coach, and apparently two of my signs are ruled by Venus.
yeah, and not only that, but you have a major aspect between Venus and Mars. So Mars is the planet of passion, of desire, of going after what you want. And let me tell you something amazing, just as an aside. Whenever I have done the charts of people in our industry, in our world, in our field, they always have a significant aspect between Mars and Venus. I have it in my chart too. It's uncanny. And when I saw that in your chart, I was like, oh, come on. Like this is something I need to I need to do some kind of research about this and look at everyone's charts, famous people, dead people, like, Dr. Ruth Westheimer, like all the people who have come before us, because like it's kind of amazing to me that
Well,
is coming out there.
I guess that means we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. It sounds like we're the right people to be doing this work.
Precisely. Yes, yes, yes. So I said you've got your rising sign ruled by Venus, your moon ruled by Venus, the two different, like a mix of the sensuality of Taurus in the rising sign. And I should say this, like the rising sign, if you know your birth time and you can get a rising sign, for a reading, you can get a really precise read on what houses all of the planets fall into in your natal chart. And it's more, if you can get that, it's really, really helpful. We can do a reading for someone if we just know their birthday, but it's always great. It's much better. It's much more accurate if we know the time of birth. So with your time of birth and your Taurus rising, what we know is that what you give to other people is what your rising sign is. It's like who you are when you're around others. And not to say that it's a false face or it's fake, but it's like a part of you that you kind of make other people comfortable with, if that means anything to you. Like, so the Taurus is like very grounding and stable, and a strong presence for other people. So when you walk into a room or you meet new people, they might experience that part of you, right?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty accurate. What I find is interesting about that is, Geminis have a pretty bad reputation for being really
I
flaky.
debunked that in the book. I'm sure you.
Right, right. But that's the sort of general reputation of Geminis. And I've always felt like I mean, that's not me at all, right? So one, you debunk that in general about Geminis, but two, it makes more sense when you realize that there's a very grounding force in the Taurus there.
Yes, yes, 100%. And so your sun in Gemini is also, I use I'm not going to get into the details about chart about house systems, but I use something called Placidus here, and that puts your sun all the way at the end of your first house, your sun in Gemini. So you have both the calming, kind of grounding influence, sensual influence of Taurus, but your sun is there too. So it people perceive you, you give off someone who speaks really well, who is really good at being in conversation with people, who can be very, very engaging. And like you explained, like that person wanted to talk to you, right? That woman wanted to talk to you and ask you all these questions and pick your brain. Like a person who, when interacting with other people, like gets into lots of conversations with lots of different people everywhere. Or it could like make a living having conversations with people in a podcast, right?
Well, that's why, I totally fell into this whole podcast thing. This was not, something I initially intentionally set on doing. But since I've been doing it now for quite a few years, and my wife used to say the same thing all the time too. She'd just be like, you have finally found the perfect job for you. You just get to talk. And it's true, it actually really is a great job for me.
Yeah, and another thing that I love about your chart is that your sun in Gemini, your moon in Libra, and I'm trying to see, is there anything else here that's working with this? Yes, sun in Gemini, moon in Libra, and your black moon Lilith, which is another part of the book. We have a chapter in the book about black moon Lilith, are all in a trine together, which is to say that they're in the same element. So, Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius are the air signs. Those are the communicative signs. Those are the signs that are sort of like about the mind, the more mental signs, so intellectual signs. So, I mean, it's just also kind of uncanny that a person who talks about sex and sexuality has these three planets in a really, really wonderful trine with Black Moon Lilith at the top in your career house, which suggests to me, in the work that you do, in some ways, you're helping people to break through stultifying patriarchal ideas about, how we're supposed to be allowed to be, to behave in this world. That's very much pointing to the top of your chart. And it's an Aquarius. So it's like very ahead of its time. It's like, it's very progressive.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I haven't actually heard that interpretation, but it makes total sense because it is what I do. In fact, one of the conversations I was having yesterday that I was just telling you about was one of the questions. So there were multiple people listening to this conversation, and one of the questions was this woman wanted to know about polyamory, and she was just curious, but the other woman who was listening got pretty triggered by the whole concept of polyamory. And she was like, no, 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 because when I'm in a relationship, I need to be like this, blah, blah, blah. And I just had to pause her for a moment and say, that's your experience. And what's good is that you know what works for you. So great, stick with that. But your experience is different from mine and is different from his, and you have to understand that one style of relationship doesn't work for everybody. And that it's good that we have multiple options, right? So yeah, it's exactly the conversation I was having. It was like breaking that stereotype that the relationship can only look one way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you ask me questions, because those are the highlights, basically. Oh, I'll add one more thing. So your Jupiter is in Pisces, which is the traditional ruler of Pisces, Jupiter, the planet, and that's also deeply spiritual. And it's in your 11th house of social relationships. So there's something about the way that you relate to other people that, is through this sort of like lens of spirituality or the divine, as well. Does that resonate?
Oh yeah, absolutely. See, this is what I thought was really cool about this. Now, mind you, audience who are listening, she did not share any of this with me beforehand. As you
Yeah.
know,
And
we
I don't know anything about you, by the way. Like I made it because we decided we were going to do this reading, I decided not to read about your biography. I've not even listened to your show. I'm sorry. Because, because I wanted to make sure that I was just reading like a clean read.
Great. I actually appreciate that. Just make sure you go listen to it afterwards now. But yeah, that was the whole point. So as you know, if you've listened to the show, we do a pre-interview call, and that's where we just kind of figure out like, what do we want to talk about, and like, how's this going to go? And in that call, that's when we decided to use myself as an example. But that's as far as it went. Like, so she knows nothing about me, as you just said. You didn't even listen to the show or read my bio or anything like that. So what I find is so interesting about that is pretty much everything that you shared in the highlights resonates significantly with me and is also backed up by what I do for a living and how I show up in the world. So it'd be one thing for me to say, yeah, that sounds like me. Yeah, that sounds like me. But everybody listening can look at that and go, if you follow my work, like, oh, that's exactly how he's actually living life, right? So it very much coincides or mirrors what you're saying, which I think is kind of interesting. I've always felt since I started doing this work that it was something that I was meant to do, but that was more just a feeling. I never actually had, like, I never had somebody tell me, this is what you should be doing because you got this, 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 and this. I was just like, I don't know. I'm good at it. It feels right. People keep wanting more of it. So, so yeah, that's kind of cool. And it's kind of what I wanted to show with this as an example, right? Which is showing the possibilities here. So, maybe if you are somebody listening who, you don't do this for a living, right? Maybe you haven't thought or put a lot of time and effort into developing your sexuality or your sexual relationship with your partner. Maybe this can show you some of the ways in which it can enlighten you, right? So that was kind of the idea. And I'm glad that it could have gone either way. In other words, you could have given me a reading and it could have said a bunch of stuff that I would have been like, oh, I didn't know about, right? And then I could have been like, okay, now I need to go maybe try some of that on and see what happens, right? And that would have been fine too, because that would have been an example of enlightening something that I wasn't aware of.
Oh, I thought you were saying like you could have gotten it completely wrong. Okay.
No, 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 no. That's not what I mean. What I mean is it could have brought to light maybe something that was in my shadow that I hadn't seen or hadn't looked at, right? And
Right.
then I would have the opportunity to go back and say, okay, well, maybe I should go try that on and see, does that actually benefit me and change my experience or not, right? So that would have been fine too. I just think but with that, the listeners, unless I came back, 6 months from now and said, well, Stefanie said this, and so I tried it, and then here's the result. Like, okay, that could work. But otherwise, we would have left the listeners a little bit in a place of, well, okay, maybe, maybe not. So I just think it's kind of cool that it actually lined up so well because you have, literally years of my work to sort of back up on pretty much everything that you just said. So that was pretty cool. I really appreciate it. Thank you, by the way, for doing that.
Oh, my pleasure. That was really fun.
I always love diving into these systems. And, I've looked at a lot of different systems, not just, traditional astrology, because, and you'll laugh about this if you know much about Gemini. In fact, it says it right in here. I'll read it to you from the book because I highlighted it.
Well, fun.
Yeah, give me one. So here we are. Okay. I know I hope I highlighted that section. I highlighted a bunch of other things. Yeah, here it is. Gemini is the first sign of the zodiac, and humans born under its influence often find it is hard to hide their curiosity, about everything. And that is literally the story of my life. This is why I've looked at so many systems, because I am super curious and I always want to know more. This is actually why I have a lot of people that I have on the show, because I'm actually curious about what they have to share. I want to know what you know, right? And people, I've gotten some really great feedback about, oh, you're a really good interviewer and this and that. And I said, thank you. But really all I do is I just ask the questions I want to know because I'm curious.
That's
So
the best way to be a good interviewer. Yeah, that's the secret.
yeah, apparently so. I didn't know that until people told me that. It's just doing what I thought I wanted to do. So, okay, we only got a few minutes left in the show. There's a couple of things that I wanted to just cover really quickly in regards to this work that I think would be important for people to know. So there's always this idea that, oh crap, my chart says this, now I'm screwed, right? So what I wanted you to do was maybe if you could talk a little bit about like if your chart says something in it that isn't necessarily favorable or good or whatever, are you just stuck with that for the rest of your life, or is there something you can do about it?
Yeah, yeah. So yes, this is one of the things that sort of like, internet and memes and things like, you know, uh, gives people the wrong idea about the way that I work with astrology, right? I think that any placement in a chart can be mitigated, can be, if you have a difficult placement, if you have, Saturn on your moon, as an example, you know, that can create particular kinds of experiences with in relationships with mothering or whatever that is. You don't have to live with that for the rest of your life. You don't have to be a certain way. You can deeply explore, learn the nature of that placement, what house it's in, when it might come up for you via transit, and learn to become, you know, stronger and more grounded and more aware of your patterns and tendencies. So, I mean, my experience is that like most of the difficult parts of our chart, the stuff we don't like, they can become our superpower. And then it's kind of how I structure the book. Like every single one of the signs, like the erotic challenges can become, your erotic, superpower as if you work through them. So that's the way that I feel about any bad thing in a particular natal chart.
Yeah, and it's just such a important point to really make is like, don't freak out if your chart says this, that, or the other thing. And, a way that I always used to like, and you alluded to this before, although maybe we didn't say it quite so directly, but you're calling it the natal chart, and the natal chart is a snapshot of what things were when you were born. But
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't mean that you're locked into that for the rest of your life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you are a being that is continuing to evolve and grow and learn and so you're not locked into that, but it does give us an idea of where we're starting and what our tendencies are and what our challenges might be and what our strengths might be. And then we have the opportunity to grow and learn and change as individuals. And so I really wanted us to make that point that you're not stuck with whatever your chart says.
Yeah, and some people are afraid to come in for an astrology reading because they're like, "Oh no, I'm going to find out something bad and I don't want to know." Like the same reason you don't go to a medical appointment because you don't want to know if something is wrong with you. It doesn't work that way. And also, like our charts, our natal chart is this fixed thing, right? But there's free will, obviously, right? And also our charts experience various kinds of evolutions as well. Like at the beginning of every year on our birthday, we have a solar return. So this is like a new way of looking at our chart for the year ahead. And we have, progressions and transits. So like there's so much moving and changing all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So don't get into a state of despair because your chart says something.
Yeah, important.
All right. I had a question on here about transits, but I think you pretty much covered that already, like how they affect stuff. But if there's any last things you want to share about that, it's similar to what we were just talking about, how things are changing, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think this is actually a good question. So I can mention something else about the way people can use the book, right? Because the book, we talked about the way that you could, get the book and jump to your own sun sign and read all about yourself or read all about your partner or your crush or your ex or whatever, right? Like you can read it like that. But one of the things that the book has been designed to do is to help people move through the wheel of the year, to use the book seasonally to explore their own sexuality. So, if you on Instagram, I'm sure everyone has seen like Leo season and Gemini season, right? Like
Mhm.
everyone talks about astrology this way. So the book is also designed, each chapter about sun signs is designed to be used by anyone of any sign at that particular time of year. So if you picked up the book as we're recording this, that would be the Leo chapter. So there are journal questions and exercises that pertain to the solar energy that's coming through the universe right now for us, right? Like we're living where the sun is currently in Leo. So we're having Leonian kinds of experiences. So how can we use that to, spice up or deepen our sexual relationship with ourselves or our partner?
Yeah, that's a great. I totally off the script question here just popped into my mind when you were talking about that. You're gonna laugh when I ask you, but what's the most sexual sign?
I can't answer that.
Come on now.
I mean, okay, fine. All right, fine. I'm just gonna say it. Aries, which is my sign, is the most sort of like hungrily right there, out there sexual sign, like with the fewest qualms about itself. It's the most animal sign. It's the first sign of the zodiac. It's the most feral sign. So in some ways, it's the most sexual sign. The idea that Scorpio is the most sexual sign is no, that's not true. Every sign is deeply sexual. Every sign is sexual in its own unique way. So I'm giving, big ups to Aries because it's my sign, but because that's what an Aries would do, right?
Well, that's great. My current girlfriend's an Aries, so happy to hear that.
Aries, Gemini, good.
Yeah,
It's a
it's just good.
sextile, by the way. It has nothing to do with sex, but Aries and Gemini that they create a mathematical angle called a sextile.
Oh, very good. We'll have to talk more about that off show. All right. That's really all the time we have. I thought this was a really fascinating and great conversation, and I want to give you an opportunity to tell the audience where they can find more about you, and then I have one last follow-up question.
Okay, yes. So the quickest way to find out more about me is to go to my website, which is StefanieIrisWeiss.com. I'm sorry, that is a mouthful. Stephanie is spelled with an F, not a PH. S is in Sam, T-E, F is in Fran, A-N-I-E, Iris like the flower, Weiss, WEISS.com. Instagram is Stefanie Iris Weiss. TikTok, which I'm just sort of doing, don't even look at my TikTok, is the real Stefanie Iris Weiss. And on Twitter, I am Eco-Sexuality, which is about my last book was called Eco-Sex. Those are the best places to find me.
Awesome. Okay. I got one last question. It's one that I ask everybody on the show. My wife actually started asking this question, so I kind of continue the tradition, if you will. And since you haven't listened to my show, you don't know what it is yet. It is, what is your best sexual talent?
Oh, my best sexual talent, listening.
Oh,
Listening.
that's a good talent. Absolutely. Hmm
Mm.
hmm You didn't hesitate in answering that, so
No, I was gonna go for the really dirty one, but I went for the better one.
you can have more than one if you want to share another
No,
one.
I'm not gonna do I'm gonna keep that private.
All right. That sounds good. Well, Stephanie, thanks so much for coming on the show. You were a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. I hope the listeners got some value out of it. But thanks for coming and sharing your talents.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
All right. All right, everybody. That's all the time I have for this episode, and I will see you next week. I hope you liked this episode of the Love Lab podcast. If you enjoyed this show, subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. And for more free exclusive content, join me in the Passion Vault at kevinandceline.com/vault. That's kevinandceline.com/vault. Thanks for listening, and remember, as Celine used to say, you're amazing.